Okay, first I'm going to take you through the materials I use in my process. That's black Colorays pencil. There's two versions of this exact same pencil that I use with different types of sharpening, which I'll explain in a minute. There's an eraser, and there's an emery board, which I'll use in the sharpening process, and an electric sharpener, which speeds the initial process up hugely. And that's 160 pound white cold press paper. I use two basic versions of the same pencil in my process. One is much more rounded, and I use this for the initial sketching phase. It's smoother. I use it for the gestural steps. So I'm just showing you how to do that now. I sort of round the tip on the emery board carefully to get it to apply very smoothly with no real sharp edging at any point around the lead. So I'm just checking that as I do it and getting off any little edges that have formed. This is after an initial sharpening on the electric sharpener. For the later stages, I use a much more closely tapered end to the pencil. So usually I'll separate pencils out depending upon how I've sharpened the tips for different applications, because sometimes I'll actually want to switch back and forth during the process. So this is for later details and finishing up the drawing. So I'm tapering that to a very fine point, and I'm just testing it there. And basically there's a comparison. It's a subtle difference, but the application of line is very noticeable. Now, usually before I get to this stage, I have a pretty complete and clear impression in my mind about how the final design is going to look. So this stage, when I first actually start putting a pencil to paper, is really only testing a preformed idea as opposed to developing one strictly. So I'm just making sure that the shapes are working, that it'll help me imagine it better. So I'm checking to see if it's as interesting as I thought it would come out in a very basic sense. Making sure that the pose seems to work and make sense, that the clothes seem to work, that the sort of direction of action is okay, that the overall design seems balanced and how I wanted it to come out. So this is quite small, as you can see. Sometimes my thumbnail sketches aren't even really readable. They're more just for me to try out major lines and shapes, and they often come out quite unintelligible. This is slightly more readable if you compare it to a later stage. It's actually quite accurate. So the direction here is the Napoleonic zombie sort of idea. It's loosely based, though much of the inspiration comes from the uniform of a French grenadier. Even some of the color schemes are going to be coming from that later. So I'm even thinking about that stage, even at this point. The sort of method, the story in the background behind the zombie is going to be there's this sort of possessing fungus that is growing throughout him. So he's going to be slightly desiccated and old, not too gooey and ripe, sort of dried out with bits of fungus, probably bracket fungus, erupting out of him at certain points. I'm giving him a really stiff, awkward stance. Sort of uncomfortable, tipped over slightly, with a degree of stability, as though he has a really strange and uncomfortable resting point. That'll aid in the impression that he has died, and the intent is to maintain sort of an awkward, slow, original Night of the Living Dead type of zombie. So they're dangerous in numbers, and they're dangerous in the fact that they sort of plod on and on and on, no matter what you do, trying to stop them, as opposed to anything that's sort of poised, ready to attack, or is especially nimble or even fearsome. I want to give him sort of a blank, vacant look, as though he doesn't really care you're there. He's not really reacting with the viewer, even though he's staring directly at the viewer. Those little spikes coming out are going to be musket bayonets that so as though two muskets are still hanging out of his back from when he's been speared by them. There's going to be a couple rips and tears in him. There I'm putting in a hollow in his stomach where part of him is just spilled out, and I'm going to introduce some intestines hanging out of that. So you can see here that I've laid in the basic major shapes and elements very vaguely, but they're sort of working well together here at this point. The character seems interesting, brings you up to the face to look at, and the whole thing's actually, even if you refer to the final piece, rather readable at this point. No point is too muddled. And it has a distinctive look. That's what's important about it too. It really has the look I was going for, even at this stage. It's instantly recognizable that it's a strange stance for a healthy human to have, and of course it's period costume. I'm just gonna add a little something there where he's holding it, so a piece of someone he's pulled off, or a piece of clothing, or a scalp. Okay, so basically this thumbnail has served its purpose. It sort of confirmed that the idea I had is probably going to work. It looks quite good. It has a nice balance and flow to it. And I'm happy with the direction I'm going to take with it. Now with the thumbnail and the basic idea solidified, I'm sort of transferring that vague gesture into the final piece of art. So this sketch I'm starting on now will be the final piece of art that we'll be using. So we have to get this step right because it'll carry through all the way to the end at this point. And we can't fix sort of the way the shape of the character is or anything like that later. Well, at least not without a huge amount of difficulty. I usually start with the sort of the pate and then the face of the character. This actually sort of captures the personality and gives a good. Usually that'll be the focal point of the design, anyways. So it's a good point to step into it. You're going to want to make sure that the proportion is right in relation to how large you're going to want the final piece of art to come out, and that you have plenty of room on the drawing medium that you're using. So I'm just layering in the sort of expression that the zombie's going to have, this hanging jaw, and I'm moving down into the torso to get that same sort of arching back. Layering in actually a layer of his coat there. I'll sort of move in. I'll do details even at this point if they feel like they're important enough to the design, sort of to at least lay in, because they'll change the direction of the viewer's eye in such a significant way. I'll actually end up drawing them. So certain small elements like the eyes are actually, if you notice, have quite a bit more line work than later other portions, and in the torso especially has been left relatively blank. You've got the plane and the direction of it, and then I've gone on to move on to other parts of the drawing at this stage just to get them properly in relation. So now I'm basically almost mimicking the thumbnail stage at a much larger scale. So the whole point here is that it's gestural, it's sketched out, it's fluid, the sense of movement is there, the sense of proportion is still working, and I'm basically carrying over the thumbnail sketch to this point in a larger sense. Though a lot of the actual line work I'm laying down here will carry through to the end, so I need to take care with that. I can't be too sloppy about that. I can be loose with it, but a lot of it actually will carry through and dictate the borders and the edging of later elements, and the actual lines will end up being used as sort of faint as they are now. They'll at least be covered over. I'm not working too large here. You're going to want to find a comfortable sort of scale to get used to working at. Usually the bigger it is, the crisper and more detail end up looking in the final version. But that can also reduce some of your line width and line variation to being almost imperceptible in the final version. So you're going to want to sort of pull in and out as you work and find a good spot for yourself. This is usually about the size I tend to work with for a basic character. I find it tends to be a good balance for the final version. You can blow it up well. The resolution will be quite high in the later stages. But the great thing about this pencil work is that you can scan it at a high DPI, and it'll look absolutely great. Double this size, as long as you're working at a detailed enough level. Now he's basically depicted at sort of exaggerated proportions here. I'm elongating the legs and the limbs, and I've shrunken the head somewhat. I tend to find this a sort of an aesthetic direction that I often take with most of my characters, some more than others. So exaggerating this more will sort of give it heroic proportions. So it'll be especially good if it's an extremely a formidable or unique character within the world. For him, he's a sort of a rank and file soldier who's sort of come back in this awful condition. So it might be pushed to too much of a point for him at this stage, but the proportioning is working. So I'm sticking with it because it's aesthetically pleasing and it's aesthetically in keeping with how the other characters in the world would be proportioned. So we might tweak that slightly later. But if you're happy with the overall look, don't worry about that so much as long as it's in keeping with how you usually work. Because slight little modifications in terms of proportion and relation can be made later. I'm just laying in the fingers now. The gestures of hands are very important in the same way that the face is important. So they often get detailed even at this stage before anything else, because they're so key to the design that you want to get those right immediately and make sure that they're working with the rest of it. Now I am of course working here much faster than I actually do. This has been sped up, this footage, so usually it'll take quite a bit longer. I'm much more careful and tentative as I sketch things. Also, my pauses have been taken out. I'll often, at intermittent steps throughout the entire process, take a minute, stand back, look at it, think about it, remind myself of how I envision the final product, and then think about the ways with which I'm going to use to get to that final stage that I'm planning on. I'll often pace around during that stage, and sometimes I'll actually go off to do another piece of work or something else while still keeping this piece of art in the back of my mind, and I'll come up with ideas or solutions to issues that haven't been planned out and detailed, and then I'll come back and fill those in. You'll probably notice that I'm not actually taking too much care with cleanliness in concerns to this drawing. I'm not using a piece of paper under the base of my hand to prevent smudging or prevent oil from getting on the piece, and I'm holding the pencil quite close down to the tip. One of the advantages of the Color-A's is that it doesn't smudge and doesn't get pulled up as much as a lot of mediums can, and the smudging effect that can actually be developed from approaching it this way actually can oftentimes add to the ambient texture present in the artwork. It can create the line to be slightly more varying and organic. And I've actually I've gone backwards and forwards during my time polishing my techniques and my approach to art, and I've actually come back to a stage where I'm allowing the sort of the messiness that ends up occurring in the process to serve the art, as opposed to me trying to avoid it or prevent it from happening. I've actually taken that factor out and merely been conscious of how the smudges, as you can see already showing up, especially where my hand tends to be on the right there. I can either remove that completely, or if the art had background, that could actually add an interesting texture which I'd incorporate in the art and use. However, one of the problems is that these Color-A's pencils are very cheap and oftentimes have a lot of variance in their quality, depending, irrespective of the make. They'll oftentimes vary simply in batches that I pick up. So I tend to go at different times and pick up large batches and then go through them and see which ones are okay and which ones to discard. So now I'm entering sort of a second pass. Now the whole character is sort of laid out. I'm going in with the sharper pencil, you can see there. And once again, I'm starting this stage back at the eyes, sort of one of the most important parts of the art. So I'm laying those in. I'm getting the brow ridge in there. Not too, again, this is a second pass, so it's not complete detailed at this point. I'm layering in sort of a second tier of detail, which will then get maybe a third or even fourth pass later on, especially the face. I'll be returning to the face a few times to tweak it and get it balanced in the right way. It definitely depends on where you want to go with the feel of the art you're making. But I tend to personally try to avoid, especially when you're dealing with fearsome characters like this, to avoid this impression that they're sort of mugging for the viewer, that they're sort of almost like the character is acting or overdoing it or overemphasizing what you're trying to get across. I try and think about how the actor should look in a normal situation. In a sense, the zombie shouldn't be trying to sell himself to the viewer. He should sort of exist in his own right. So I have to be careful about not overdoing his posture and his gesture, and not overdoing the way his face appears in that sense. Sometimes you can exaggerate at certain times to sort of play off a mask sort of motif where things are overdone. But overall, I tend to try and tone it down. What's important here at this step is that I get the essence of the outline of the structure I'm doing, as opposed to trying to fill in the entire thing with detailed texturing. I've done the outside of the fur hat with a rough, ragged edge, and then I'll be adding an ambient pencil texture to that, which will sort of imply that very obvious silhouette texture carries through the whole prop, the whole part of the costume. Now, as I draw, I often rotate the end of the pencil. So if I need to, I can return to an edge that's become straighter and sharper and use that for a detailed line, or I can rotate it back to the edge that has become rounded simply through my previous drawing and use that to lay in more general sweeping lines. And as I do this, as I rotate it, I actually sort of continually sharpen it slightly so I can keep the point going on for a longer period without having to stop and sharpen it again. The sharpening pauses you'll have to do can oftentimes really break the momentum. If you've got a really good stretch of sketching going, you're going to want to avoid that. You're going to want to lay out maybe some pre-sharpened pencils, and certainly have extra pencils around in case yours breaks, or you end up getting down to a point where the pencil's too short to comfortably continue working. You can see how the edge of the coat sort of is underdrawn through where this bracket fungus I'm drawing here comes out over. I'm going to have to take care about that and make sure I go back in and really remove the way those lines go down through that, because even at the later stages, they may end up showing up as a ghosting. Since they're a continuous line that moves down through a logical portion of the character, the viewer's eyes will make the connection. And it will slightly create either a ghosting effect or sort of an obvious little mistake or mess. You'll notice that I often jump around the work, drawing different elements and then sort of cutting loose and going and drawing a different disconnected element of the work. I think this is usually because I'm thinking about the entire design as I'm going through and detailing it. And in my peripheral vision, oftentimes I'll often apply an idea. And then what I'll do is, on a whim, I'll immediately move to that section where I've come up with a solution to how it should look, and then lay that in. And so I'll sort of move around the entire project doing this. Now, a key part of these intestines that have sort of spilled out of his abdomen is that they're actually relatively decorative. They're sort of these tassels, these curved points that are an element of the design, almost as though they were part of his uniform or his dress. And that concern sort of is present in all of the aspects of it. Even if they're not supposed to be decorative, there's sort of a purposeful aesthetic arrangement to how they hang or drape or lay over the rest of the design. While he's supposed to look disheveled and ruined and completely unaware of his appearance, and the clothes are hanging off and coming apart and are muddy and beaten and worn, I'll still think about how they appear aesthetically, even within that scope. So I don't want him to look completely falling apart in a sort of a laughable or an idiotic way. So even though that would actually make sense, I'm not actually going to put his pants falling down. And I'll have concerns about how it looks. So if his hat is cocked to the side or something, I'll actually make sure that it sort of works with the design. You may want to make a character look purposely ridiculous, but oftentimes you'll want it to continue with the theme you're going for specifically, which in this case is is a sort of a horror character. So you don't want anything too obviously comedic in there. Now, just as a spot of interest, I'm going to add in this sort of torn bit coming out of his boot there, and maybe I'll show a bit of his bone showing through and some extra meat. This again echoes the big open cavity in his abdomen and other sort of severe injuries that he'll have. You have to be careful that you don't overdo parts like that. Here I'm going to add a little bit of the boot being open and showing his toe. You do have to be careful about overdoing these elements. Certainly with aspects like blood and gore and damage done to the character, you can dress them up too much, and so it becomes sort of a contrived mess to an extent that's distracting from the impression you want to give. That said, you do actually want to orchestrate these elements to suit the design and to draw the viewer's eye around, and even for storytelling. So if it's supposed to look like he's been through some sort of event, his injuries can actually depict that and tell that simply through how they appear. So in this case, the two muskets that'll be hanging out of him indicate that he's been attacked from behind by two living soldiers who could still use their tools and their weapons. Now, the way his fingers are actually brought up and curled up here are basically anatomically impossible. You can't do that with your hand. So here he sort of had this arthritic or rigor mortis set in, and his knuckles have swollen, and his fingers have curled up in an impossible and rather painful looking way. And I've kept this consistent on both of the hands. The hand gestures are actually very important to the feel of the character. So he has this knotted, twisted, tormented gesture in both of his hands. Modifications like the one thing I'm making here to the hat are basically just for the sake of the illustration, as opposed to for the concept or the design of the character. I simply thought that his hat should sort of come out to the side more for the flow. I've decided I'm not too happy with those eyes. They're a bit too dark and muddled, so I'm going in there with an electric eraser to fix this. And I'm just going to completely take those out. I'm going to be working with the same basis because they have to be in relation with the face I've already laid in anyway, so it's not going to be a major change. But I'm just going to reintroduce them with a slightly different look than I originally had. They had a bit too much of a malicious character than before. He seemed too conscious. He was giving a stare that was directed as opposed to blank. This is all stuff that's sort of hard to quantify, so you really have to get a feel for it. And oftentimes you'll only notice it later on, like I have now. So I've actually added it more of a drooping brow, not a sad look, but sort of a less conscious look to him. After finishing up the fixes on the eyes, that sort of introduced the third pass we're going to be doing over this now. So I'm actually going to go in after fully detailing the eyes and begin to fully detail the rest of the design, and moving away from the face, basically where I started, and then touching back here and there. One of the things I'm liking with this design so far is actually this sort of the combination of this decrepit, decaying, gruesome character and my ability to put in these little extra flourishes because of the costume choice I've taken. So there's this great mix going on with the little this sort of elegant feather coming off the top of the side of his hat, and the sort of the decorative embroidery that's going on in his decorative suit. It's a really nice offset to a lot of the other parts of the characters, and it's great to have that sort of transition where those decorative parts are getting ruined or ripped or stained or bloodied by the creature that's basically wearing them now. When you're working with a lot of small detailed areas, like around here in the face, especially where I'm going to end up doing the teeth and some of the fungus coming out of his mouth, you're basically drawing at such a scale that your line work has to end up really just being points of shadow, so sort of absence in between the objects you're trying to draw. I mean, this is in keeping with a lot of drawing concerns, but especially so when you're dealing with little points like this. So those little small dots of shadow that go in between the teeth at the point where they meet the gums really help to end up popping out the outline that goes around the teeth. When you're dealing with very obvious and notable parts of the design, like these epaulets I'm putting in here, you have to make a very conscious decision, in this case, since we're making them ragged, to actually damage one or remove one or make one offset, because they're so eye-catching, especially because later there'll be a gold-yellow fabric. They're so eye-catching that sort of breaking the symmetry of his costume is going to create a noticeable and sort of hefty imbalance. So if you're going to do that, you have to have things to compensate for it, and that imbalance has to be a part of the art, and part of the design in general. So in this case, I've actually left them quite intact. One of the great things about the bayonet points coming out of his chest is that not only are they an injury to him, which illustrate that he could be severely damaged without dying and he can keep going with that, but they also actually offer sort of quite a fearsome and dangerous feature for anyone who's going to get grabbed by him, especially if he acts like sort of a conventional zombie, in the sense that he's going to reach forward to bite into somebody. There's sort of this storytelling chance that someone may actually get pulled onto the bayonets that have gone through the zombie himself at an earlier point. So they sort of serve this dual function of a threat and an injury to the character. That sort of element also carries through, and is quite in keeping with the idea of a zombie, because you have this element of them basically being a victim, but you also have threats of things like contagion, and he may infect you when he actually attacks you. So it's sort of this compounding of threats in something which, in and of itself, isn't actually strictly predatory. Just here to show that it isn't a sort of a clean puncture, I have a bit of flesh and of fabric being stretched up and caught on an earlier part of the bayonet, which is sort of stringing down back to the torso there. And just here I'm adding a little inlining bit to the side of his jacket, so you can see the color of the inside lining of the jacket as it's sort of being pushed open by the fungus forcing his stomach open. Now, when I'm actually adding in this sort of quick pencil shading here, it's more of an addition to the drawing and the line work and adding texture as opposed to strictly shading. So I'll add that when I want a texture that has that kind of rough or complicated addition to it, and then I'll work with this pencil work later on. Oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with parts like cloth, you can actually sort of continue the drawing in with more subtle line work that shifts between line work and that pencil texturing. It also adds a curving sort of sense of contour lines over the surface of something. So if you think of those old things like old engravings, they'll curve the engraving lines over the surface. So they'll be shading, and they'll also imply an additional level of drawing detail, because they show you how the planes and the surfaces of the objects you're drawing work in a 3D space, and that'll really add to it. And even when it gets worked over several times in the later stages, oftentimes little additions like that will end up showing through and really sort of clinch what you're trying to get across. You can also use it to really get across the material that you're depicting. So if it's wood, you can adjust that sort of shading across its surface to imply a wood grain. And again, with things like puckered meat or skin, you'll sort of it'll be much more puffy and wriggly, the texture that goes over top of it, and you can just subtly shift the look of the shading that you're applying. And it'll greatly contribute to how the material translates to the viewer. Using that approach, you can actually, in the later shading steps, just use things like dodge and burn set to midtones, and you can actually end up bringing out subtle touches like that more if you want them to be really apparent. If you're really happy with certain things that seem to have happened, sort of like the way those little tendons in the top of his hand are already starting to form. You can go in the later shading steps and just pop those out even more. So you can go back and work that seems to have been too obscured can now be brought forward. The scalp he's holding in the clenched fist sort of contribute to illustrating the method with which he may end up attacking a victim. It's pretty much in keeping with sort of commonplace zombie expectations that they attack with their hands, and they usually don't carry objects. In this case, it's actually a piece of a victim that's come away in his grip, as opposed to him holding a weapon or a tool, say. You can see, just to further illustrate the fact that it is a scalp, I left a bit of sort of the face attached. So you've got the eyelid there and a bit of the eye socket. And then you can see it curving around and see a bit of a flap of the inside coming around to the side. So it doesn't look like he's just holding up a piece of roadkill or a fur ball or something. Even if someone can definitely tell it's a head of hair, those little additions also contribute to the fact that he's not actually just gripping a toupee in his hands. Well, probably someone will logically default to assuming it's a scalp in the setting. Just sort of clarifying points like that leave no sort of ambiguous element to it. Again, here with the viscera, you have to make sure that it comes across as internal organs coming out, because it could actually be, if you're too vague about it, it could be read as different elements. So it could be a sort of a collection of worms coming out, or some sort of a tentacle or creature type element. So it's important that even little touches like that, which would seem obvious, are clarified. Now, it's important with these intestines, the way they droop like that there's the sense of sort of a hanging elasticity to them. I've enlarged them at the bottom as though they're full, and that's all collected down at the base of the curve, and then they actually get quite thin, and also the segments get stretched out as they draw up into the internal cavity. The top layer is the top large intestine, which droops over top of the collection of the small intestine, and then the smaller looping bit coming out the bottom is a loop of the small intestine. It's actually pretty key when you're working with small, detailed line work like these tassels that you actually put down the line work quite fast. You'll often do a better, smoother job when you do that than if you actually take too much care and hold back too much. Of course, later on when you're finishing up major steps like the drawing stage, you'll actually want to go against this rule and slow down and sort of move across the entire thing, adding little bits here and fiddling with little additions and maybe little removals, just to balance the whole thing out in a very sort of fine-tuned way. But for this stage, again, you're going to want to work quickly. You'll find you'll do a better, smoother, more confident job approaching it in that fashion. Here I'm actually adding sort of stains and a mess running down from where his stomach is burst open down onto his pants. Normally I'd leave that to more of a painting stage, but that's going to be such a dominant mess that I'm setting it in here. You can see here how his legs are really locked straight, and that implies a very stiff gait as he sort of shambles along. Little touches like that in his gesture contribute to sort of perceiving the direction with which this character may end up getting animated or depicted in a extended project after this conceptual stage. It's sort of an easy mistake to gloss over the feet and the connection with the ground plane when you're doing these floating concepts that are sort of divorced from any related environment or setting. But you have to take a lot of care with them, because especially if it's going to be mixed into live footage or something like that, where it connects with the ground is going to be key, and it's going to be a sort of a noticeable trouble point. So you're going to want to make sure that the design at least looks good at that part of it. And of course, just in terms of the drawing, the success behind the drawing, you're going to want to make sure that it looks like the character is standing stably on the feet. These sort of if not a static, then at least a sort of a maintainable pose at which you've captured him, unless you've implied him in a moment of movement, which isn't really the case here. You're going to want to make sure that the ground plane is implied by the way the feet rest on the ground and the way the legs come down from the body, and the fact that the whole character is properly balanced. It's key that you convey the thickness and the type of fabric you're depicting simply in the way that it folds and curves around other objects. You'll get a feel for this as you go through and do different types of fabric. In this case, you're dealing with a lot of sort of wools and layering bits of felt and leather. So it's usually quite thick, and the fold's usually quite large and slightly curving. Of course, in this case, it's also assumed to be somewhat soaked and hanging poorly on him. So it's not a very smart, crisp dress that he's in now. But the fabric still has to match that and convey sort of what it's initially made of, but also the conditions and the situations it's been through. You have to be careful with extremely recognizable parts like the hands here, because people are used to seeing hands, and even if they're not fully aware of it, they know basically how they work, and they're going to immediately recognize that something is odd about his posture, the way his hand is held, the way the fingers have curled up. So you have to make sure that you sort of go further in explaining it. If you're going to end up twisting conventional things that people are used to seeing a lot, you really have to hit it home that something is wrong, and you've done it on purpose, and hopefully is wrong for a reason that the viewer may be able to deduce when compared with the rest of the design. Of course, you have to actually be careful about piling on these kind of unnerving twists to your character. Usually it's a good idea to have one or two major ones, especially if you're going to deal with odd things that aren't as sort of expected, at least within the framework of the design, that you can focus on. And then once you've focused on that, the viewer can sort of say, well, everything else seems sort of expected for what I'm seeing, and this one thing stands out. If you pile it on too much, unless of course that's actually the look you're going for, you can actually pile it on and just have some sort of inexplicable Lovecraftian mess where it doesn't seem to conform to any expected rules. But in this case, actually, you're really going with sort of a conventional base, something very corporeal that you're dealing with. In fact, even within the setting, he's quite conventional, and you may be used to seeing him within the story before anything strange even starts to happen, because he's basically just a dead soldier. So what the major sort of supernatural element is that he's gotten up and he's animated and he's doing things now. Simply strictly by virtue of his own appearance, he may actually not be that odd in the setting. If I'm going to make any small changes or additions or modifications as I go through this, I'm going to want to make sure I get it done in the pencil stage, because once it's scanned in the digital stage, it's just too hard to sort of mix into this pencil line. It becomes too noticeable, and it's frankly too hard to mimic. So if you're going to if you have to do it at a later stage, you're going to have to actually go back, draw it, and then scan that and transplant that in. So you want to make sure that you fixed any little areas before you scan it. So you want to step back, take some pauses, give it some time, look at it in a mirror maybe to get a fresh perspective on it, and then modify and tweak any parts you want. If there's something you're worried about ruining, in case you're not sure if your improvement will detract from it, you can give it a quick scan and then try the modification and just replace the old scan once you're happy with it, as long as the modification ended up working. Basically, the amount of finishing I put in here at the pencil stage saves me a huge amount of time in the later digital stages. Little bits like shading and finishing off line work in a proper, full way here can save huge amounts of work instead of having to compensate for it with shading and glazing. And the shading stage can simply bring out the work I've put in at this stage. So I want to make sure that I'm completely happy with what I've got at this point, and that it could almost be a standalone piece of art simply by scanning it in and cleaning it up. So here I'm basically just finishing up the line drawing, making sure I'm happy with it and cleaning up any areas that seem to have been glossed over too fast. Now here I'm basically going to do a rear view. This is to get more of a perspective on how his uniform works, how his stance is. Since it's going to be modeled later on, I could have done this. I'll be doing an orthographic view later, but I could have done this in a slightly more forefront view in a more normal stance. But the problem with that is it won't get the texture, the feel, and the pose that's key to the way the character looks, acts, and feels basically to the viewer. So in this case, to further express the odd pose and the obscured bits, I'm basically using the original drawing as a guide, and then drawing in a perfect reverse view. So sort of an opposite 3/4 view of the same character. So I've basically leveled up the major sections of the character, again starting with the head and the shoulders, the torso leading down, and I usually again leave the arms till the end. It's faster going on this simply because the gesture of the entire character has already been planned and decided, and I'm mimicking it at this point. I have to keep the angles of those muskets the same as well, and the proportions pretty similar. Obviously, things can be slightly different because there's a different perspective on them, but the tilt should actually be noticeably the same. Since we'll be touching upon this design from almost every angle, it was important that I understand the elements I was introducing in the first initial front view, and basically understood how they should end up playing out from these different angles. So I had to think about how the two muskets were angled and how one rested on top of the other. And of course, I had to go even farther than that and think about things like how it may appear when he moves. Is it going to hinder his progress too much, the way they're hanging out behind him? That sort of element's key. So here they're almost partly responsible for pulling his torso back in that way. That weight that sort of that rests on his rear there and sort of pulls the torso. It's important that your design works from these different angles too. I mean, there still has to be elements of interest. He can't just sort of have one good side that looks really cool and then the rest of them is really boring or looks odd and just doesn't work. Because if he's a character who's going to be moving through a world and seen in all these different sort of positions and situations, it's important that the feel of the design and the success of the design carries through the whole product. Now here, like of course in the earlier stages, I've gone back to a very sort of soft-nibbed end to the pencil, with which I can gently and subtly sketch across the whole thing. It's less of an issue, the gesture here, because I'm working with something that's already been settled, but it's still important that the drawing is fluid and captures the same essence of posture as the original front view. When you're doing extra views like this, it's a good idea to complete them soon after you've completed the original concept idea. If you leave it too long, you may come up with some new ideas that'll end up conflicting with the original notion you had in mind when you're executing the extra views. Okay, so here I'm actually going to add in some more damage and detail to the character. He's obviously been shot or hit in the back of the head there. And I'm actually going to add some more damage down back where the muskets enter. Nothing incredibly dramatic. Nothing as eye-catching or as dominant as the open abdomen on the front of the character. Because as he moves around, again, you don't want anything competing too much with his more eye-grabbing and important injuries that have already settled out on the front. So I'm just adding a little bit of spattering here and there of extra detail and extra storytelling to his condition. While it's at a scale and an amount of detail that isn't immediately apparent at this point, if it was a larger or more detailed shot, it would be key to think about how his clothing is ripped back to show those holes in his back and in his skin. So there should actually be layers of underclothing showing through where it's torn open like that. And that'll happen down later on to the lower right, where it's ripped open and it'll have an undershirt showing or something like that. An extra layer of cloth that'll also be a different color. And may even rip in a slightly different pattern. So you have to think about that when you're pulling parts of your character away. You have to take into account what may lie underneath, because the details are key there too. If he's running around commando basically the whole time, you'll actually be surprised how, even if you don't consciously notice it, it'll sort of detract from the immersiveness and the believability of the way the character appears. It's also important here that I left that major large strap that attaches to his satchel. It is pierced by the muskets, but it carries completely over his back and still has a connection point tied to the satchel on the character's left side. So it's important that I sort of disconnect it at this point, and then somehow the satchel is still holding on, despite the fact that the strap has been ripped in the back or doesn't carry through. So I really have to make sure of concerns like that. Again, things like the sleeves, the ripped sleeves. If it's going to have a complete disconnect like here, it's sort of rumpled down and bagged up and collected up against his right wrist. Here I'm just putting in the flintlock muskets that are piercing his back, and their bayonets are coming out the front. I've already basically decided on the design direction I'm taking with these. I'm not going into a huge amount of detail here. There'll be a more detailed shot of the musket itself, which I'll be doing later for the other extra views to further illustrate this prop. But for here, a lot of it is obscured either by the front one or simply by virtue of the angle with which they're positioned in there. And they're basically just repeated. They're the exact same model. I took care to make sure that the flint and hammer is on the right side of the musket, of course. Elements like that can actually be a major factor because they sort of conceptually prevent you from mirroring the image, so flipping it horizontally. Because elements like the hammer on a gun, it's important that they're on the right side if you assume that they're made for a right-handed user. So elements like that may actually have to be kept consistent. They kind of anchor you to the point that and prevent you from sort of mixing up or messing around or flipping images later on in the digital process. You have to be careful not to overdo the folds in large areas of clothing like this, even though you want it to be really rumpled, and he is slightly bent back. Overdoing the folds and the creases will basically imply that there's something odd going on. There's way too much fabric in that part of the clothing. I mean, the amount of fabric, if it was pulled tight or bunched up, would have to make sense for the character to move inside. So it has to look right for that. So you have to be careful when you're doing really crumpled clothing like this, not to overdo it to the point where the viewer may notice that something may be wrong with how the original costume should have been laid out on the character. When you're working on small details like these, they're almost in themselves decorative elements of the character. They're little stories that the viewer can go through and see, but they also sort of add this this textural movement to the way the viewer's eye travels through this. So you can see the hole in the back of his head is sort of led up through his little ponytail into the back of the skull, and it actually lines up quite symmetrically with the rest of the hair and the head. Again, you have to be careful about areas like where those bayonet points come out on the opposite side of the character here. Don't draw them touching up against his outline, or they'll look sort of out of place. You're not quite sure where it's coming out of, if it's his shoulder or what. Even in context, even when you know what they're supposed to be, it's a good idea to just fade them off and sort of exaggerate that spatial depth in the line work stage, and then that'll also be indulged in later shading and glazing stages as well. As I go in here and detail the left arm and the sleeve coming down from there, I'm actually going to leave it off and sort of let it fade off before it touches the edge of that musket. This gives a bit more of a sense of space. It's getting very detailed at that point where they'd actually join up, and it would cause this sort of complication there. It would look like they're joining up, a bit like all the amount of detail that connects and touches each other, where the ends of the musket actually go into his back. So I've just faded that off, and it'll give it a sense, more of a value. The shading will also fade off later on in the digital steps, and that'll aid the sense of depth and the fact that they're not touching each other. That his left arm is much further, not much, but there's a sense of distance between that arm and the muskets. I'm not entirely sure exactly how a scalp would peel off, so for the inside layer here, I'm leaving it pretty simple. It's also important that I don't put too much emphasis and too much detail into that prop, since it's not actually really important. It's just sort of there as garnish to dress up the rest of the design, and it certainly wouldn't be something that would consistently show up in different versions of this type of character, this type of zombie. So I don't want to go into too much detail and too much explanation with that, both so it doesn't detract from the important parts, but also because it simply isn't as important as major elements in this design. As I'm applying this contoured shading texture, I'll use sometimes I'll switch back and forth between the softer and the sharper end, depending on how much I want the actual line work to show up. So if it's a rougher, more textural surface, I'll usually go with a softer tip to the pencil, which will give it more of a rough effect. And then if I want the surface actually to look smoother oftentimes or more delicate, I'll go in with a sharper pencil end, and I'll have to be a lot more careful with the line work. So now I've basically settled the entire character from two major views, which collects most of the design. Now here I'm going to do a sort of a profile action shot of the zombie. It's a completely different pose. It's giving a lateral view of the previous gestures and designs we've laid out. And this will actually be in a pose of lunging towards someone in an attempt to savage them or bite them. So again, I'm going to work beginning with the brow and the eyes and the pate of the head. Lay that in. I know the hat's going to go across that, but I usually put in the dome of the skull and then work things like hat and hair on top of those. For the purposes of this detail, I'm going to sort of leave it off as a bust shot, so it's going to trail off once it reaches about the shoulders, and then I'm going to focus on the side of the face, the focal point of the zombie in a different view, so that the modeler gets a better view of how the whole thing is proportioned, and also how it may end up acting, how its gestures may be from different views. The face is such an important part of the character and the design that you're usually going to want to give it its own slightly zoomed in or highly detailed portrait shot, basically. In this case, it also offers a different gestural action shot as well as an alternative view. But it's also focusing on conveying more about the way certain details in this lateral view, like the way the hair is tied back and the way that bracket fungus emerges from his mouth, are really sort of brought forward and explained better. The process here is much more direct and less exploratory, as I know exactly how the zombie should look by this point. So the process is faster and cleaner and much more direct. Here you can just see where I've actually put that bayonet coming at too sharp of an angle. I mean, the whole length of the musket would have been angled completely up from his back, which just wouldn't have worked. I had to imagine how that musket would have angled out if I continued to draw it out from the drawing, and it was just totally imbalanced. Like the whole thing would have bent, basically, or sort of shifted downwards. So I've made that happen in the design, because it would have to rest somewhat down on him. There would have to be some give, some leeway. It's really important that I maintain the blankness of the face in this case. So even though he's in the moment of action, and if any time he'd be showing some sort of reaction in his face or emotion, it's actually very purposely absent here. So he's still got the blank stare. He hasn't got curling lips and the brow, his eyebrows and the ridges there haven't really changed that much. So the face has deformed, but in a very sort of cold, empty, fish-like way, as opposed to anything that a living creature would do. Basically, now since it's finished up, we're just going to scan that in, and then with the other extra views, I'm going to shade this down to the bit where the bust basically sort of trails off and leave that going off to white. Now here I'm basically just going to give a more detailed view of how his musket works. It's shortened from what he'd probably be carrying accurately from the source material. So it's probably a mounted weapon, a carbine of some sort. And even though it's been depicted twice already in the two immediate views for the front and the back, I've gone in detail here because some of this was obscured, and it's such a key element that's actually going to be repeated once, that I'm just going to lay it out, show how it looks, how it's proportioned, and how details of it will actually end up sort of interacting with the character, things like the strap we're going to put on it and how the bayonet projects off. This also details the elements that sit inside the zombie, since he's speared through by them. So if that's key, or if they ever end up, say, during an animation, falling out, or something else ends up happening, or even another type of the zombie could be carrying this, because this could be the regular armament of whatever his group is. So this could actually be something that other versions of the zombies within a larger group could actually be equipped with and still holding on to, as opposed to have speared through them. So extra detailing on this is pretty key and helpful to the later stages of development. You may have noticed that I haven't actually been using any rulers for this during any stage here. I tend to find that I'm better off relying on eyeballing straight lines now. It tends to stiffen the drawing when you introduce rulers. If it was a particularly precise or technical type of drawing, I'd probably bring something in. But I basically rely on making sure that, and I'll look at it from different angles, maybe quickly look at it in a mirror, just to make sure I got the initial straight lines right, because that is key. If you get that looking wonky at the beginning, no matter what you do with it later, it'll look odd, and that wonkiness will stay, and it'll get quite difficult to fix once you fill in the rest of, or more of the drawing. But generally, I don't like to bring in things like rulers and set squares and things like that. They just slow down the whole pace. They can mess up your gestures. I find they often make me stop paying attention to more important factors that are key to the drawing. Any sort of minor deviations or little things that need to be touched up later can oftentimes be just slightly straightened up in the digital stages after it's been scanned. But you certainly shouldn't rely on that. Ensuring that you have a nice sharp tip to your pencil is pretty key when you're working with more technical parts of the illustration like this. Here I'm just ensuring that there's going to be a little bit of variance, sort of a wavering within that strap there, to really set it off from the slightly more accurate straight line of the stock and barrel of the musket. Now, it could have been really tempting to make this musket really elaborate, really fearsome looking and ornamented, but it's important that you sort of have a sense of relation with everything and a degree of understatement. If you make every character have this amazing beastly weapon, nothing will have any more impact when you try and go farther, when a character is supposed to be especially unique. And in this case, he's basically just a rank and file soldier who's come back as a zombie, who's probably going to appear in hordes. So if you overdo elements like the things like the weapon sticking out of him, or parts of his design, you'll sort of overload the viewer's eye with that. That's sort of a really big temptation that you have to resist, not to overdo things to the extent where it becomes muddled and convoluted. Okay, here I'm starting the orthographic shots of the character we've already solved and basically laid out. This is sort of a very straightforward face-on, stiff, positioned rotation of the character in 3 separate views in the exact same head-on position. So I'm working quite small here because a lot of the major details have already been presented in the initial concept sketch, and this is sort of to aid in the proportion of him in relation to different views of himself, standing in a slightly more robotic and obvious position. In this straight-on view, you can actually see that really the only thing offset in his uniform now is just the hat being a little crooked. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't want to make the clothes impede his movement. I wanted his movement to hinge entirely upon his affected anatomy. Now here I'm just going to quickly use a set square to do some adjoining lines at major intersections of the character, just so I have a guide to keep it perfectly proportioned in the same way as I rotate the character. We'll get rid of these later, and they're not too strict. They're just there as a quick guideline as I quickly lay in the character. I could eyeball this, but there's no harm, and it's not initially distracting just to quickly lay those in at this point, just to make sure I've gotten it right. You can notice with this comparison where I have the straight lines next to the sketch lines that every time I sketch, it's very sort of smooth and organically shaped. There's really no straight or sharp edges that at least don't taper organically. This is pretty key to the look and the feel that I go for in my art. If I stiffen up and do these sort of angular sketch lines, it'll end up giving it a completely different final impression, even if I end up curving my lines in the later stages of the drawing. Now I'm just going to go in and erase all those guidelines. I mean, they were very vague. They may not have been completely necessary. They were just there to give me an idea to keep it proportional so the whole thing didn't skew slowly to one side or the other and that were in relation. So I get rid of them now so that I'm not constantly worrying about them and checking them in my peripheral vision because they may actually end up getting in the way if you're constantly looking at these sort of guidelines and these measures structured around your drawing. Detailed areas, of course, like the embroidery on the front of his hat, are sort of rendered down to the basic shapes and the basic curves that are present in them. You can always look at the original concept to check for that, to see how they're designed and get a feel for them. For this, it's more about the different parts of the whole character in relation to each other. So it's not so much of an issue to get down into exactly how the locks of his hair work and the embroidered bits and the stitches and the details of his clothing. Now you can see here that I've actually removed the muskets from the rotations. I'm going to leave their craters, so the points where they're driven through him. But for the sake of perceiving his costume and his body structure, I've removed those sort of extra parts to show the underlying elements. Since basically all you have to do is model the muskets and then place them in him according to where the entry and exit holes are. I've kept them out of this. One of the key differences in this stage from the earlier stages that I've drawn is that in no means is this an illustration by itself. So the aesthetic decisions are based purely, and have already basically been settled, but are based purely upon the concept and within the design of the character. In terms of the actual positioning of him, and the way he looks on the paper is completely unimportant. So that factor and that concern has been completely removed. In fact, adding too much interest in things like that has purposely been avoided. He has to have a really basic, stock straight position so that everything can sort of easily be seen. You don't want to force him into a position that would be impossible for what you'd want the character to do, of course. But you don't want him actually doing anything interesting for this stage. Some of the sketchy outline that's remaining around these characters is definitely going to have to be cleaned up and properly managed in the digital stage, simply because these drawings are small at this point. There's no it would be a much better idea to do it at a later stage than to go in with an eraser at this point to clean up the contour lines going around the character. Even though a lot of the elements of his costume here are just sort of these ripped hanging rags like on his sleeve, you have to keep those consistently torn in the same way, hanging in a consistent way among all your different views of the same character, because it's really easy to sort of fudge these torn, ruined bits of the design. But you really have to keep them in check with each other and keep it consistent. At this angle, you can get a better view of how those knuckles curl up on his hand there. Unfortunately, in the other extra views, maybe the hands didn't get enough coverage, so it's good that we have that lateral view to really get more of a sort of a sense of how those how he's sort of injured and arthritic in a full 3D form. When you're putting in things like these injuries here, it's important to think about what would have caused these. So you have these really deep wounds for where the muskets are going through, and possibly those two other wounds on his back are from the bayonets, but the caliber of those musket balls are so big it could also potentially be that. You can see here that I'm just drawing the arm in slightly closer to his body as I go through the original sketch lines. It's a good idea to use the original sketch as a gestural guide, but if you notice little things you may want to tweak or tighten during this later detailing process, it's a good idea to go in and just slowly lay it in, check to see if it's working, and then continue with it, or quickly take a step back and adopt a more accurate rendition of the original sketch. Well, the silhouette your character makes is really key to the impression the design gives. So even though his hair is tousled in a really messy, inconsistent fashion, it has these distinctive little flips that come out sort of below the eye level, and that has to be kept consistent in all the designs, because his hair is, while not incredibly important to the essence of the design, has to be kept consistent because they convey an amount of personality. You can see here, because of the stance I chose, his arms and especially his hands are slightly obscured because of the edges of his lower jacket. I could have put his arms coming straight out to his sides with the palms facing out forwards, but then the other two views may have actually suffered some of the explanation because of that. So in the end, I settled on this approach, which also looks a little bit more natural. You can see that by this point, after doing so many drawings of the same character, at so many different angles and in slightly different positions, that you can really end up getting a feel for how he should exist in a sort of 3D space, and how everything sits on him. And you also get a sort of a development, even by redoing things without focusing on the personality. The character tends to come across the more times you go over it, and it really begins to solidify. And thankfully, since I think it was successful, it sort of confirms that the original design is working. After doing all these extra views and having them work as well, using the same basic direction and aesthetic behind the original. Since these drawings are smaller than the original large concept art, I can actually do more passes in one go here. So you can see that I'm adding in more detailed line, as well as doing that sort of textural shading, all sort of in the same step. I'm also scanning over and jumping around less. I really am sort of going from top to bottom and finishing up each pass, since I can do that on these smaller format drawings. You can see here on this rear view that the curvature of the fur texturing I'm putting into the hat sort of conforms to the fact that the hat is slightly leaning back in this position, as opposed to sort of going over the front curving dome on the front view, or conforming. It's certainly all the hairs in the fur hat sweep up and around the form of the hat up to the top, where it sticks sort of straight up, and that has to be kept sort of in a curved consistency over the entire body of that piece of the costume. You can actually end up seeing details forming here that were completely obscured in the previous rear view because the muskets have been removed. So you can see how the symmetrical aspects of the back of his coat and where those buttons are. Okay, so that basically wraps up the orthographic rotation views and the traditional medium segment of the process. So I'll be basically taking this whole collection of concept art through to the finished stage and painting it. Okay, so now I've scanned in the image at 800 dpi. I usually go towards a larger end of DPI than I need, and then you can bring that down once you've scanned it, if you need the process in the computer to be a bit faster. I've desaturated it to reduce any of the, or remove any of the ambient color that would have gotten scanned in, and I've expanded the canvas with white out wider than the original scan, just so the borders are farther away from the figure, so it doesn't impede on my perception of the figure. Now I've used a lasso tool to select the figure. I've inverted that and deleted that to white. Now I'm using the dodge tool set to highlights, just to erase around the figure. This is much more forgiving than using an eraser, because if I end up moving in and touching the outer lines of the character, it usually doesn't affect them too much, but it's extremely good at getting rid of that ambient paper texture. I've moved the character figure up onto its own layer above a white background. And while we probably could have used the paper texture in the final art, it probably would have added a bit. We're actually going to be adding a paper texture back in later. While I could have used the one that was already there, I need a selection of the character separately anyways for the later shading steps. So I've decided to go in and clean up the ambient paper texture to help me create a permanent selection of the silhouette of the character, which we can then work inside without any of the shading spilling out. I've moved the drawing up to its own layer above a white back. Now I'm just affecting the levels on the drawing there, bringing the darks to be a bit darker. And I've created a new multiply layer on top, which I've filled with white. So now what I'm doing on that multiplied white fill layer is I'm using the burn highlights tool to go in there and basically just add black. I could use a paintbrush and be adding black on top of a transparent layer as an alternative. But I keep it this way, and then I can go back, and when it mixes together, I sort of know I'm on the same page with this tool. So right now I'm just blocking in the major dark areas. The fur hat is obviously going to be much darker than most other parts of it. The dark leather satchel, the dark coat, and the leather boots. The stocks of the muskets are going to be darker overall. The hair on the scalp. So I've laid those in quickly, leaving parts like the white pants and the face and the skin somewhat lighter. A little bit of shading has been put in just to give a bit more form to some of the shapes. For the sake of the glazing step later on, you're going to want the actual silhouette of the character, any parts you'll be painting later, to at least be a reasonably dark level of gray. You want to avoid leaving any of the white in there, because that won't glaze very well when we're applying. Even if we're applying a glaze of white, we can apply that to a gray and then brighten that up later, but it's much harder to darken it in the later processes. So you'll want to sort of edge towards a darker gray shading overall for the entire character, but you also will want to avoid patches of absolute black, because you can overdo that, and then that's on the opposite end of the scales, though less so, harder to work with later on, and the glazes won't take to it. Now, I'm not too concerned about a light source at this point. It's mostly just sort of adding to the drawing and explaining the forms that we're seeing more. So bits that lie under or in crevices are just going to end up being darker than ridges and things like that. So it's sort of going through it and sculpting it more than anything at this point. So just sort of finishing up the drawing completely. Much like in the drawing, I tend to sort of jump around and apply these steps to areas that almost catch my fancy as I scan over the work. Sometimes it's more systematic, the process that goes over it, but usually what I'll do is I'll jump to an area I suddenly want to change or catches my eye, because I know what I want to do with it at this point. So you'll see I'll sort of jump around the character, come back, and finish off areas I've missed from earlier. My brush is just one of those gradated airbrush standard choices. I could mix around and try and make my own or use other ones which introduce some sort of texture, maybe something more painterly. But I usually find even at this point, the paper texture and later the textures we're going to lay on top already introduce enough of a variance and enough of an interest to the point that introducing anything more painterly is just going to either obscure or muddle the textures that are already happening in this. Not to mention that you also don't want anything sort of working over top of the line work that's already there. If it was too painterly, you'd end up obscuring that and basically undoing a lot of the work you've made in the drawing stage, which was half the reason you did it that way anyways. Most of the folds and creases have already been dictated by the previous drawing line work. So with this shading step, you're not actually introducing much more to it, simply applying more detail basically and bringing out the choices that have already been made. There is a certain sort of choice matter at this point in how much you want to accentuate some parts of the previous drawing. So for those pants, I'm not actually making the creases too deep. Whereas on the leather boots, I might be accentuating that more as the materials become more crumpled and the material is thicker too, so it has deeper creases in it. Oftentimes I'll actually end up taking a step back. And so even though I'm doing more of a detailed, specific amount of shading here, I may zoom out and then start to apply more of a general shading or try and darken an entire type of material uniformly to set it apart from neighboring materials. While there is no actual setting depicted here, of course, I still may take a bit of time concerning myself with the idea of the sort of the atmospheric or the moody character of the lighting I'm going to end up applying in the shading stage. So if it's some sort of subterranean character, I may make the overall shading a little bit hazier and darker. If it's some sort of ethereal or luminescent character, the whole thing might generally be brighter or even partially illuminated from within. This can take more of an effect later on when we frame the entire thing, because that may take on an impression, an overall dark or light impression, which may affect how the shading plays off of it. So I have to think about those concerns even at this point. So I'm really am envisioning the end result, because decisions building up to that point will have a major effect.